вони розуміють, що ми їх бачимо, але ми не можемо їх дістати своєю зброєю.
Если это решение будет принято, это будет означать не что иное, как прямое участие стран НАТО, Соединенных Штатов, европейских стран в войне на Украине.
Russia says it's fighting Ukraine, but its leaders are now openly declaring a new reality. They're no longer talking about a special operation, they're calling it a war, and they're naming their enemy. The Kremlin isn't just pointing at Kyiv anymore, it's pointing directly at Brussels, at Washington, and at the heart of NATO. So when did this shadow war become a real one, and what does it mean for the world? In a notable development on the international stage, former US President Donald Trump has articulated a new stance regarding the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, suggesting that a complete restoration of Ukrainian territory is an achievable outcome. This perspective marks a significant shift from his previous public comments on the matter. The statement was delivered, "You are a whore, Wally of Taboo Major," via his Truth Social platform, following a discussion with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which occurred after Trump's address to the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Historically, President Trump has consistently voiced a strong desire to see a resolution to the war. Yet his earlier assessments often implied that a negotiated peace would likely necessitate territorial concessions from Ukraine, a proposition that the government in Kyiv has firmly and repeatedly rejected. This latest communication, however, presents a different vision. President Trump stated that with robust support from European nations and the NATO alliance, Ukraine could potentially win all of Ukraine back in its original form, specifically referencing the recovery of the borders as they existed prior to the full-scale invasion in 2022. He pointed to mounting economic pressures on Russia as a pivotal factor that could facilitate this outcome. This evolution in rhetoric is being closely analyzed by foreign policy observers, as it aligns more directly with the stated war aims of the Ukrainian government and underscores the dynamic nature of international diplomatic positions concerning the conflict. Of course, here is a rephrased and expanded documentary article based on the provided text, adhering to all your specific requirements. In a significant diplomatic development that has captured international attention, former US President Donald Trump has articulated a newly evolved and more assertive stance on the war in Ukraine, suggesting not only that the nation could reclaim all its lost territories, but potentially even achieve gains beyond that, though the specifics of such an outcome were left undefined. This pivotal shift was announced on his Truth Social platform following a substantive conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, which took place on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly. Notably, the former president's statement focused on the borders from the start of the 2022 full-scale invasion, without making reference to the status of Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. President Trump framed this new assessment as a conclusion reached after a deeper understanding of the military and economic dynamics, asserting that Russia and President Vladimir Putin are in significant economic trouble, a moment he characterized as a critical opportunity for Ukraine to act, and describing Russia as a paper tiger. This change in rhetoric did not go unnoticed or unanswered in Moscow. The Kremlin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, was quick to offer a response, suggesting that the altered American position was a direct result of President Trump's dialogue with President Zelensky, representing a vision that completely contradicts Russia's own. Peskov firmly rejected the premise that Ukraine could successfully reclaim its territory, stating that the situation on the front lines speaks for itself and renders such a thesis erroneous. In a pointed rebuttal to the paper tiger remark, Peskov insisted that Russia is in no way a tiger, but is more accurately associated with a bear, and he stated firmly that there is no such thing as a paper bear. While he denied that Russia is in broad economic trouble, he did concede that there are points of tension in certain sectors of the economy, an acknowledgement of the pressures exerted by global sanctions. Meanwhile, from the Ukrainian perspective, President Zelensky publicly welcomed what he termed a big shift in the American position. Speaking to reporters, he expressed optimism that the United States was prepared to provide security guarantees for Ukraine once the war concludes, though he clarified that specific details on the nature of these guarantees, such as the provision of advanced weapons, air defense systems, or drones, have not yet been finalized. In a subsequent television interview, President Zelensky revealed that the tone of President Trump's post had surprised him, but he interpreted it as a profoundly positive signal, indicating that the former president and the United States would stand with Ukraine until the very end of the conflict. He further suggested that a contributing factor to this diplomatic realignment may have been President Putin's history of dishonesty with President Trump, creating a distinction in trust that now appears to be working in Ukraine's favor. Of course, here is a long-form documentary article crafted from the provided text, adhering strictly to your requirements for accuracy, tone, and quality. In a series of consequential statements at the United Nations General Assembly, former U.S. President Donald Trump significantly amplified his rhetoric toward Russia and its ongoing conflict with Ukraine, marking a stark departure from his previously advocated positions. The day's events began with a bold suggestion directed at NATO members, proposing that alliance nations should actively shoot down Russian military aircraft that breach their airspace. This comment came in direct response to a recent and concerning pattern of incursions by Russian fighter jets and drones into the sovereign airspace of several Eastern European nations. Countries including Poland, Estonia, and Romania, all members of the NATO alliance, had formally reported such violations, with Poland and Estonia officially requesting alliance-wide consultations on the matter. The gravity of these incidents was immediately underscored by Poland's foreign minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, who responded to President Trump's suggestion with a succinct and telling message of approval. Roger that. This escalating situation prompted a swift and unified response from NATO leadership. Following a meeting of the alliance, a formal statement was released condemning Russia's actions as escalatory and irresponsible, and warning that NATO would employ all necessary tools to defend itself. The alliance's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, emphasized that while NATO remains a defensive pact, it is not naive to the provocations it faces. This sentiment was powerfully echoed by Poland's president, Karol Nawrocki, who declared from the UN podium that his nation was fully prepared to defend its territory and would not be intimidated by Russian military posturing. Moscow, for its part, denied any deliberate violation of Estonian airspace and dismissed the incident over Poland as an accident, offering no comment on the reports from Romania. When pressed by reporters on whether the United States would support NATO allies if they were to follow through on his own suggestion to down Russian planes, President Trump introduced a note of strategic ambiguity, stating that such support would depend on the circumstance. He instead pivoted to praising the military alliance for its recent commitment to significantly ramp up defense spending, a move he has long championed. This firmer stance on NATO and Russia's airspace incursions formed the backdrop for a more profound and unexpected shift in policy. For much of the year, President Trump had maintained a pessimistic view of Ukraine's prospects, privately telling President Zelensky that he lacked the necessary cards to win a war of attrition, and publicly suggesting that a peace deal would inevitably require Ukraine to cede territory to Russia, including reports of a potential plan to press for the surrender of the entire Donbass region. This position represented a clear alignment with the realities of the battlefield as they stood for many months. However, in a dramatic about-face articulated on his Truth Social platform, following his meeting with President Zelensky, President Trump declared that Ukraine could, with support from Europe and NATO, win back all of its territory in its original form, and perhaps even achieve more. He justified this new optimism by pointing to what he described as significant economic pressures on Russia, labeling the nation a paper tiger. This new posture, offering a vision of total Ukrainian victory rather than negotiated compromise, was hailed by President Zelensky as a big shift and a positive signal of enduring American support, even as specific details on future security guarantees remained undefined. The day's events, therefore, revealed a significant evolution in the former president's approach, moving from advocating for a pragmatic settlement based on territorial concessions to championing a more ambitious and uncompromising goal of full Ukrainian restoration, all while reinforcing the NATO alliance's right to defend its borders with decisive force. So, where does this leave us? The undeniable conclusion is that we are in a new and more dangerous chapter. Share your respectful perspectives in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the stories behind the news, make sure to subscribe.